Hello everyone, and I'm Roger Mosey, Master of Selwyn College, and we welcome everyone here in the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium in Grange Road, and also all the people joining us online in Britain and around the world. Now, I can't avoid tonight that thing about our guests needing no introduction, but we are delighted to welcome Professor Mary Beard, one of the best-known academics in Cambridge, and someone with a worldwide reputation as a classicist and a wonderful broadcaster, and although she might contest this term, a public intellectual. And it's, I knew she'd contest it. It's our usual format tonight. I will talk to Mary for 25 or 30 minutes, and then the second half of this session will be questions from our audience. And if you are watching live online, you can send questions to me via master@sel.cam.ac.uk. That's master@sel.cam.ac.uk, but pretty obviously that will not work if you're watching on demand. So, Mary, good evening.
Hi.
We called this session A Cambridge Life, and you are, I think most people would recognise, one of the great figures of Cambridge, but in your valedictory 2 or 3 years ago, you said to everyone's surprise that you still feel like an outsider in Cambridge, and everybody was really taken aback and thinking, Mary Beard, an outsider in Cambridge. So why do you feel that?
She looks as if she's been here forever, doesn't she? You know, looks as if she's at home. It's hard to put a finger on it, but because I've had a wonderful time here. I've done everything that I want to. Nobody's been particularly mean. Or not consistently mean, right? And my best friends are here. This is where I live. But the best analogy I came up with, and I think this is better really than imposter syndrome, which is overused, was that if I kind of thought what it had been like to be here, it's like having spent 40 years in a nice hotel. Right, and I've got, it's been super. The service has been great. The rooms have been great, and I've got upgrades, and I've been upgraded to the penthouse suite, and it's wonderful. But it's still a hotel. It's still not quite where I feel I kind of belong, and part of me, I suppose, feels a bit regretful. Because that's not because I haven't been supported. I think Cambridge is very good at supporting people. I think I feel strangely grateful for that, actually. I mean, I can think of nothing worse than a Cambridge populated by everybody feeling they belonged there, that everybody was at home. Now, I'm being, it's complicated because I'm not talking here about feeling rejected, feeling, unsupported, not having any help. But I think that being an insider can sometimes be worse than being an outsider. I'm not sure we want institutions where everybody feels on the inside.
But I say to students that we are Cambridge University. If we're not Cambridge University, people in this room and people watching online, who is?
Oh, it's, Cambridge University is none of us. I mean, that's, I suppose, I think. I mean, we're passing through. And for me, I can't imagine it possibly could have been better. Somebody had said to me when I first came to Cambridge to have a look to see if I might nerve myself to apply, because it was terrifying. I was the first person in my family to get a degree. This was something completely new. If you could have said to me then, do you know, in just over 50 years' time, you'd be a professor, you'd be an honorary fellow of your college.
A Dane.
Oh, a Dane, yeah. I would have been just I'd have said, don't stop teasing me, because, and yet I think I think the idea of feeling a bit humbled by it isn't bad. Realising that everybody else, almost everybody else that you like, does too, you know? And, you know, I think, you know, people say, and I've said this myself, you know, so I'm criticising myself. No, you can't come in this formal halls and, you know, you don't know which knife and fork to use, and there's too many glasses. And I was once at high table in another college, and I was put down. Actually, I was about to be about 40. And when my host said after dinner, you have put your claret in your port glass. And I thought, you've just revealed yourself for you're the insider that I don't want to be. That's the insider. But we all feel, you know, the secret is that you're not the only one feeling that.
But at the time you started your academic career, being a woman was essentially to be an outsider.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I'm hugely pleased I went to a women's college, because when I was a student, there was 10 to 12% of all the students in the university were women, and it was considerably fewer in the classics faculty, I can tell you. You know, it was posh white men, some of whom became very close friends, but they were still posh white men. And I remember vividly being in my very messy Newnham room once, and one of my posh white friends came in and picked up my essay that I'd had marked off the floor. This was in the days when they were all handwritten, you know. And it said at the bottom, you know, this is really rather good work. This is certainly first class. And he said to me, you get a first? And I thought, the only reason you're saying that to me, you have no clue what my essay's like. The only reason you're saying that is because I'm a woman. And, you know, actually, it puts iron in your soul. You know, it either cripples you, or it puts iron in your soul. And you know, I think it's very hard to know why some. And I'm thinking about women here, but some, you know, there are many marginal groups to what is perceived as the centre of Cambridge. It's very hard to know how some, even on the bed and breakfast basis, how some people, in a sense, thrive and some people don't. And I find myself sometimes being a bit too confident about being able to manage that, and not to see that some people aren't that confident to manage it. You know, and I think that, you know, I've tended to laugh at the sexism because it is so silly. I mean, the thing about sexism is some of it's outrageous, and you know there are really serious issues, but a lot of it is just ludicrous. And you know there were kind of stories that I picked up when I came back here as a lecturer by senior blokes saying, how do you it's when people's names were still written on finals papers. How do you quickly mark finals? Don't worry, everybody, if it's not like this now, right? And they'd say things as a joke. Oh, but first of all, you take all the women's scripts, and those are your 2 1s. And then you take the men and you arrange them round them. I mean, as a joke, it would get you sacked now. Then it was thought to be slightly quirky. You know? Bloody hell.
No, I suspect we'll come back to your career when we get questions from the audience in 20 minutes or so. Let's talk a bit more about current affairs and current events. And you've been spending quite a bit of time in America. What does it feel like now with this second Trump administration?
I'm choosing my words carefully. What many people say to you, so I'm choosing my words carefully. What people say is they say, do you realise that a revolution is taking place? Now, this is not the kind of revolution where you've got tanks going through the streets but there is a political, social and cultural coup is happening. No, I'm not going to avow that or disavow it, but you kind of see how you can think that. You can the kind of and actually party politics aside, the kind of liberal social and cultural order that I think, I'm a boomer, right? That the boomer generation sort of took for granted. A kind of big notion of society, hugely important stress on the independence of the arts and culture, and plus, good social security benefits. That actually is being dismantled. Now, I think that in part it's our fault that it's being dismantled, because I think we didn't realise that was happening. We didn't realise that was the bottom line. But when you see in the United States, when you see the Librarian of Congress being dismissed by the president, you think this is dangerous. Dismissed because she had put in unsuitable books into the children's section of the library. Now, if anybody knows the Library of Congress is like the British Library. It is not a library for kids, right? She did actually open up a little room that is available for children, who they could come and discover what a library was like, 5 mornings a week. And she no doubt had some, we know what kind of books, they were sort of DEI sort of books. And she gets sacked. And this is where I kind of think, God, maybe I'm just old, and this is kind of politesse, but saying something like, I can't remember, Clara was her name. Clara, basically, no dear, no, this is to give you notice that your employment is terminated. She was retiring next year anyway. If you were really worried about the books in the children's section of the Library of Congress, you could have waited a couple of months.
And yet, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Nicholas Kristof, who generally I suppose is part of the New York Times liberal ethos, said this, and I'll read a sort of slightly long quote. He said, "Liberals took steps they thought of as inclusive, such as endlessly embracing pronouns, land acknowledgements, and terms like pregnant people, that bewildered voters or left them feeling excluded. Worse, there's a tendency in liberal circles to denounce anyone sympathetic to Trump as a racist or a bigot or a fascist, and it is always distasteful when educated elites employ invidious stereotypes to dismiss millions of working class people."
I have some sympathy with that. I mean, I think one of the worst moments of the previous campaign, Trump's previous, was when Hillary Clinton, whom I, for whatever fault she has, whom I admire, called Trump supporters deplorables. That was a real low point. And I think that that is part of what I was meaning by saying, the liberal order was disintegrating. And we weren't criticising some things we perhaps ought to have been criticising. I'm speaking as part of the liberal order. We weren't criticising. We let things that were sometimes deeply irritating to very many voters, sometimes were a bit ludicrous. We didn't say, hang on a minute, maybe we ought to be concentrating on, on this or this or this. We didn't. We weren't self-critical. We thought that somehow everything on the liberal side, we call it woke if we use the word, was fine. And I'm guilty of that. And I think we just should have said, have we noticed what's happening? And we just didn't notice, I'm afraid. So, it's like Brexit. It was, I remember in Brexit, sitting down in the evening over dinner and saying, oh, isn't it, it'd be so awful to leave the EU. And isn't the Eurostar great? You can get from the centre of London, the centre of Paris in only a couple of hours. And you thought, you play that to some voters where I come from in Shropshire. You've never been to Paris, let alone think it's wonderfully quick to, get on the train at St Pancras and get off at the Gare du Nord. And we were tin-eared.
And do you think there were times in the past 3 or 4 years, and I think the tide has turned a bit, but were there times in the past 3 or 4 years when we felt we couldn't say things, when we felt that if you said something wrong, you were then ostracised or, what people, I suppose, call cancel culture?
Yeah, I think that's true, and it never quite happened to me. Not quite, but I got some pretty dreadful pile-ins. And I think the dreadful pile-ins came as much from the left as from the right. And I felt more upset by them because I thought, I'm on your side, for crying out loud. And I did think, look, everybody, if I am the enemy, God help us, because there's loads more, much worse. If I just occasionally put my, say something that isn't quite online, we're fellow travellers, and we ought to be able to criticise each other. We should be able to disagree, for crying out loud. The idea that somehow you have to sign up to a monolithic culture, and that many of these issues are issues that, as any one of us knows, are deeply complicated and have been around forever. I mean, I had a great time once going to a high school where the kids were talking about free speech. And they were anxious and quite outraged by some things, but they were a bit cautious because they were afraid that they might say something that would not go down well with their peers. So at a certain point we said, do you know how long free speech has been an issue? All these 14 or 15-year-olds thought it had been invented with social media, as a problem. That there'd be no free speech issues before Twitter, right? And so they were taken aback when we said, well, look, we'd like to know about Giordano Bruno or perhaps Socrates. Perhaps we could talk about Socrates. And they didn't have the foggiest clue that people have been debating free speech for 2,500 years. When they did see that, and when we told them about Socrates, the discussion really lifted its quality because, look, you can say what you like about Socrates because he's not going to cancel you. He's been cancelled, he's dead, and you're allowed to say, well, I think he should have been put to death, quite frankly. And, I'm partly of that view within the terms of Athens myself. But if you say that about Taylor Swift, you'll be, oh, my goodness me. So I think that's part of the answer to another question I'm sure you're going to ask, which is why is classics useful? Because there we've got a bit of freedom. We've got a place where we can talk about these things.
Now, related to this, museums. You are a trustee of the British Museum, yeah. And that goes back a fair bit. One of the things that you hear people saying is that museums now, we should find ourselves there, that we should see expressions of our identity there. True or false?
Broadly, false. Now, I've got one caveat to that, which is that my husband's here, 2 of our grandchildren are mixed-race kids, and I know that going around a museum, an art gallery with a pair of mixed-race kids, you have to make an effort to help them see that they're not, why and how they're not seeing themselves. I see that, and I see that issue. But I think I've spent, as you said, some time recently in America and going around a lot of museums, and I go around a lot of museums here. And I know that what what museum senior management want, because it seems this is the kind of, they want a museum in which people find themselves. And whenever I hear this, I say, I want a museum in which you realise you can't find yourself. You realise that the past is different, that art is different, that what brings the function of a museum into the most glorious technicolor. It's a bit like, I mean, I suppose this is, you'll say, this is a repeat of me saying I feel an outsider. You know, maybe I'm too hooked on the idea of being an outsider. But I think not being able to say that's me in a museum teaches you more than being able to say that is me, because it never is. You know, it just never is. And I think it's the sheer destabilising, uncomfortable difference that you find in a museum or art gallery. The fact that you know you're not like these people. It's no good just showing me a kind of another woman with long white hair and saying, there's you in a painting, because it isn't. And the kind of understanding that difference between our own personal experience and how we might see our relationship to what is presented. That's a challenge at a museum, not to install bouncy castles and tell us to find ourselves. Right?
Now, as we discussed,
I even hate bouncy castles more than finding us.
You are one of the world's leading classicists. You're probably best known to most of the population, though, for doing television. And there was a scene I saw in one of your programmes a few years ago where you were talking about Caesar. And there you were at the start of the programme in a baby delivery ward with a caesarean section having happened. And you, I think, literally holding a baby. I mean, do you ever think what a ludicrous medium television is?
I am going to defend this, and then I'll give you another example. The defence of it is the BBC does always want programmes about blokish heroes, so you can suggest all kinds of things and then say, how about doing a programme about Julius Caesar, right? And the producer of this programme is a good friend of mine, said the one thing we've got to do in this programme, it's just a one-off, is make sure that all the women haven't switched off after the first 2 minutes, right? And usually, how do programmes about Julius Caesar start? They start with kind of yomping over the Roman army boots seen in close-up or whatever, and all the women say, oh, come on, darling, can't we have Claudia Winkleman on, right? So she said, we've got to go for a bit of Caesar that will make the women say, no, this is really interesting. So we decided, although it is a total myth, completely untrue myth, that the Caesarean section has got anything to do with Julius Caesar at all, we thought we'd start with a myth. And it was at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, and this wonderful obstetrician and the families concerned said they were really happy if we came and saw a Caesarean section. And they got fantastic footage of the birth. Each of the families went away with really high quality TV footage of the birth. And one of them called the kid by a Roman name. I can't remember what it was. Really exciting. The one place you're right, where I thought this is the power of telly gone too far, was they handed me the baby before the father. And I thought, hey, what do you do? So I thought in some ways it worked. And I think that sometimes the ludicrous aspects of telly really reach people. And my favourite example of that, where I really had been very, very uncertain, was when we were filming in Trier. I don't know if anybody's been to Trier, good sort of Germanic town, and we had to get across to the audience how it was that the Roman Empire in late antiquity divided itself into 4 bits with separate capitals, right? You know, quite difficult. And the same producer actually said to me, I thought, how are we going to do this? We're going to go, I've booked a table at a pizza restaurant, and we're going to go and we're going to get a pizza, and we're going to pretend that's the Roman Empire, and we're going to cut it into 4, and you'll have some olives, and you can show where the capitals are. And I said, no way, you know, absolutely, you know, Caesarean section is one thing, pretending, you know, how naff can you get, pretending that the Roman Empire is like a bloody pizza, right? She was actually very clever, and she said, all right, well, how would you like to do it? And I said, well, no, I'll just explain it. You know, we'll go into the basilica, nice basilica, and I will explain the division of the Roman Empire. And so everything was set up in the basilica, and I started to say, one of the problems about the Roman Empire had always been its size, right? And one of the things that was then, and after about 15 seconds, I thought, this is so boring, right? And I had another go. I thought, like, brighten this up, you know. This is the division of the Roman Empire, terribly quick. And it was just as bad. So I said at this point, all right, let's go to the pizza restaurant, right? Which we did. I don't know when the only difficulty about doing the scene was that the pizza was quite old. I don't know when they made it. It was terribly difficult. The Roman Empire proved very hard to divide, actually. But we did it, and it was much easier, you know, because it could be a bit light. There has been no more popular scene that I've ever done on telly, to judge from email responses, than that. People write and say, that was brilliant. We never thought you could show the division of the Roman Empire using a pizza. And I am prepared to boast that I was honest. And I said, I thought it was a terrible idea. And it wasn't my ideas, but thank you for saying, and it worked.
So we're almost halfway through. So can you get your questions ready, please? When you are doing television, though, and you slightly shuddered at the words public intellectual, but do you have to these days slightly, I can't avoid a phrase like camp it up a bit? You know, you wear your trainers, you wear interesting glasses.
Camp it up, my trainers?
You go on Question Time, and there's a rather sort of hyped up version. Is that the way that we now have to deal with the fact that people can't cope with arguments and complexity in a way that we might wish were the case?
Well, 2 things. I mean, public intellectual, I bridle only because you would never use it as a self-descriptor, would you? No. What do you do? Oh, public intellectual, actually. That would be the end of the conversation, wouldn't it? I think that... No, I've got 2 more things to say, not just one. One of the things is that what you see on telly is me. I mean, I think that one of the things I was always worried about was that I would be turned into somebody I wasn't. So, you know, no makeup or all the rest. And I wear my own clothes. Nobody gives me a clothes budget. I wish they did, because I could have something a bit nicer. I wear my own clothes. They're me. They're my trainers. They're my glasses. And everybody here is too old ever to have come to my university lectures. The style that I adopt on television is how I teach. That is what it is, right? I think it takes me quite a lot of nerve to watch myself on TV. And a gin and tonic, probably. But when I do, I don't always think it's great. You know, sometimes some bits better than others. But I do recognise it's me. You know, and if you didn't, that would be really scary, I think. But I also think that there's a kind of undertext to what you said, Roger, which is that somehow if you put a bit of humour into it, if you... it's like the pizza. If you do it something slightly different, if you're not kind of some kind of, old bloke who, used to be on telly 50 years ago, chewing on your pipe and being very serious, if you're not like that, somehow you've dumbed down. And I think that I think the thing I'm proudest of about the kind of telly I've done is that it celebrates the complexity of how you explain what's going on in the ancient world. And in order to celebrate that complexity, you've got to draw people into it. You've got to make them feel, And you don't do that by pretending that you're Sir Mortimer Wheeler or somebody like that. Or even Melvin Bragg, So
okay, if you're watching live, master@sel.cam.ac.uk will get a question through. We've got some coming through already, but we'll concentrate on the audience here. And Tissat has got our wonderful throw microphone.
Those are really good. Aren't they? They're really good.
Can you signal if you'd like to ask a question, please? Oh, come on. Well, it's always right at the back. Is there anyone? We'll come to you in a minute. Is there anyone? Let's go up there.
I've come at least half a mile, so if there's no questions,
we'll get to you in a minute. Yeah,
it's going to feel...
Hello?
Okay.
Brilliant.
Brilliant conversation. I was just wondering, having had a very long and successful career in academia, and also us touching on kind of current issues at the moment, are there any particular issues within academia as an industry that you think kind of desperately need addressing going forward into the future?
Funding, basically,
yes.
Money. And I think that in all kinds of different ways, actually. I mean, I confess to being a boomer. I said that, nobody in my family had had a degree before. I went to university on a government grant. Partly one of the reasons that I want to do telly is that that's payback time, actually. Writing books not just for academics, doing programmes. And I think governments only gain by generosity. They don't lose by it. But I think that in the terms of the wider funding of universities, as soon as you start penny pinching, as soon as you start saying, well, I think that computer science is really worth it, but I'm not sure that classics is, you set the academy against each other. And, every scientist I know supports the arts. I mean, maybe there are some in their burrow somewhere that don't, but I've never met them. Right? And the country needs a strong education sector, and it doesn't need us to be quarrelling. And sometimes our quarrels are not a very good advert. I think that, I told you about talking to the teenagers about freedom of speech and how difficult it was, and it went back a very long way. Sometimes people in the university maybe need a bit of help to see what a complicated issue freedom of speech is. Maybe some of our arguments don't show us off at our best, but I think those are often prompted by a divide and rule policy, effectively, from our masters.
Tissat has very cleverly materialised on that side of the room. So, yes, please, your question.
Would you use the word feminist to describe yourself?
Yes.
And if so, how and why?
It seems to me such a no-brainer that I'm not going to give you a very good answer. And I think that I suppose it was brought up as the idea of women's opportunities, women's pay, women's rights, being the equal of men was something that I was just brought up with. It was, I had absolutely kind of classically mid-20th century feminist mum, so, it wasn't much identity politics. It was rights to nurseries, rights to pay, rights to maternity leave and so forth. But a very supportive father in that respect. And it's always seemed to me self-evident that the basic principles, we can disagree at the margins, the basic principles were so self-evidently true and fair that I couldn't imagine thinking about it otherwise. But I think it's a bit like the other question. I think the rights of women are very important because it's fair to women, right? But I think the rights of women are very important because it's fair to us all. You know, if we don't help ourselves as a culture, if we don't take advantage of the talents of half the human race. And so it doesn't seem to me that this is, in essence, there are elements of this, but in essence, this isn't a sectional thing. It's just, it's totally obvious we need everybody on board. And we need, and that would go for other forms of discrimination, race, class, whatever, I'm sure I'd say things now that, not every modern feminist agrees with. I think, like I said, it seems to me that an awful lot of what people say about women, sexist things, it's just funny, It's ludicrous, it's ridiculous. And instead of getting too cross about it, maybe you should laugh at the buggers. I think that often helps. And that's not a very popular view always. But.
Next question, please.
Before I begin my thought, I was just thinking, would you also consider the term equalist being a better term than feminist, perhaps?
Well, it might be, but I think we're stuck with feminist, probably. I mean, we might have invented it differently.
Yes.
But
on the subject of being an outsider, looking around this audience, I wanted to ask about a term that you used a while ago about the provocations of Trump may be revolutionary in a positive way for the future.
I'd like to think that the provocations of Trump could be revolutionary in a useful way, and I don't think that's impossible. I think that the casualties that will be suffered en route to that might be greater, the collateral damage could be greater than what we would think of it was acceptable. I think also, when I think about that, I mean, I suppose the thing that worries me, perhaps strangely, and this is a very academic response, things that worries me strangely about the current regime, partly in America, but not only in America, is the crudification of political language, the crudification of political debate. Now, it's not, one group of federal employees who are the victims. It's us all, and I don't know how you unlearn that sort of the idea that you talk about big issues that you need to discuss responsibly, that you talk about them by saying, he's a nice man, he's a nasty man, he's not very bright. Now, can you draw back? I don't know how we're going to be able to draw back from that, and, reinsert complexity and nuance and also respect, in some ways. I look back to, I find myself looking back to George W. Bush, and I'm old enough to remember him. And at the time, I seethed with rage about George W. Bush. I thought, I was younger and idealistic, and I thought, now, he seems to me like someone with whom I disagreed, not someone who was kind of devil incarnate. And that was because he did argue with people. He did discuss. And the same. I mean, I read something by John Major recently, in the newspaper, and I used to think John Major was absolutely awful. And there he was, arguing, as he always has done, for prison reform. And I just not noticed. And I think that kind of rhetoric is really in danger, and then we've lost more than we might ever have gained.
Yes. May I just say one thought? I think from the perspective of the entire globe, that the assaults that are underway or have been for the last 50 years outside of Europe and US may be something that need discussion and attention.
And a careful, hard, honest look.
Yes.
We've got about 20 minutes left, so make sure you ask your questions in the next few minutes to make sure we get as many people in as possible. I just want to stay with one online question that's coming from Owen, who's actually watching us live in the United States. This depends what box sets you watch, but he says a TV adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale has just reached its finale. Do the early stages of its dystopian scenario have echoes in Trumpland?
Many people think they do. I think there's a problem about seeing fiction. I think Handmaid's Tale is a great book. There's a problem about seeing fiction too easily as a predictor or an analogue for current real-life events. The same goes for, is the current president of the United States like Nero or like Caligula? The kind of those simple equivalences, I think, probably mislead us. But Atwood's very smart, and you cannot but be struck by the assault on the rights of women over their own bodies that is essentially central to The Handmaid's Tale. And I hope it puts iron in our soul, even if it's not predictive. Maybe we have to say, this is important.
OK, more questions, please. Sir. Just wait for the microphone to reach you. It's coming.
Thanks. If you don't feel at home in Cambridge, is there anywhere where you do feel at home?
The kind of simplistic answer to that will be, number 120 Huntington Road, I feel quite at home. But actually talking this evening is finding myself being quite keen on maybe a self-constructed outsider. That's the issue. Makes me think that perhaps I don't feel. Perhaps I'm committed not to feeling at home. Perhaps also, and this is more worrying for what I'm saying, perhaps it's a privilege of the real insider to say that they don't feel at home, And that's where I'm vulnerable. It's very easy for the insider to say, I've always been an outsider, when maybe other people's perception is truer.
OK, we're going to Jeffrey, who's our MCR president.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. Just have a question about your thoughts. Some of your themes are somewhat overlapping to me, in the sense of, in a museum, one shouldn't find their self. And then you also went over the sort of Brexit and where you were from, that the talk in London wouldn't match then with the talk in, forgive me, I've forgotten the name of where you're
Shrewsbury.
from. Yes.
Shrewsbury.
And I wonder if that just might be a reoccurring theme in society at the moment, somewhat from an evolutionary perspective. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist and a psychologist. So in that sense, we tend to other people and build strong group connections, and that group connections can be good, but it can be bad because it can lead to othering. So in that sense, I wonder whether we've just gotten into a major relapse into too much group connection, too much trying to over-identify with groups in almost every sort of social or other sphere in different domain-specific areas in our lives. And that's leading us into a lot of the problems we have then, because we have this large need to identify, and how you might view that historically.
I think that, sort of putting that in my terms, it would be to say that a raised commitment to identity politics, put it in the most general terms, it correlates with a good deal of cultural standoff between different groups. I think that is no doubt true, and I think it's something that you see very clearly if you're my age, right? And you see it in people's rhetoric, in asking questions, not now, but in seminars. When I was a student, nobody would start the question by saying something like, as a white, able-bodied woman, and then followed the question. And of course, I noticed that very, very strongly, because that's, I would never, ever have started my question by a self-identification. And I find it quite rebarbative, actually, because I think it is foreclosing on some of the ways I might want to respond, because it's not only kind of othering, but it's also, it's putting up a fortress, around, I am making very clear to you where I come from and where do you come from. So, some of this is, some of this is quite interesting and quite good, and to see, in terms of, say, classic seminars, to see that our reaction to some of what we think of as entirely academic historical problems might actually be impacted by our own, let's call it, identity. I think it's one of the positive changes, you might say, of my career. It's also very off-putting. It's both positive and off-putting.
Okay, more questions, please. Yes, David.
Yeah. I think these are good. You have to.
Yeah, David is an undergraduate historian, so.
Thank you very much. You talked a bit about freedom of speech, and you also talked about funding, and I wanted to sort of put the two together and ask, how do we decide, especially in humanities subjects where there's less obvious material value than science and far more ideological and political value, who gets to decide where funding goes in history and politics? And is this something for governments to decide, or for academics to squabble amongst themselves for?
I think that's really difficult. And, I suppose it's true that through most of my career as an academic, academics have moaned they haven't got enough funding. We are in the 70s. I just got my first job in 79. But we look back to the 60s, the mythical era of the 60s, when, you could get a new university lectureship in, beekeeping if you wanted it, because there seemed to be such a lot of money going around. I think that was probably a myth. And the question is how we adjudicate ourselves. I'm very concerned that this is not government's business, and I'm very concerned in the academy being self-governing. But the academy's got to act responsibly. And I think... I retired 3 years ago, but people often say to me, and you can tell me whether I'm right or not, people say, it must be terrible teaching in university now because you must always run the risk of being cancelled, and it's all this, you can't say what you really think. And I know that there are some really important and I think disgraceful examples of that. But in my last year's teaching here, I didn't kind of walk around the Faculty of Classics kind of looking over my shoulder and wondering who was listening to me in case I was saying the wrong thing. And I think there is a kind of a massive exaggeration of how the academy is currently working. Now, I think it is an exaggeration. I don't think it's entirely untrue. And I think it's hard to have a self-government within a much more diverse, rightly diverse community. When it was only posh white blokes running the place, they easily decided what they wanted lectureships in. What they did, right? And there was discussion at the margins, but it was relatively easy. And now, the interests that we represent, they are different. And, unless we can find a way of helping us, you can't resolve the differences, but helping us manage the differences. And we're not always very good at it. But we're not as bad as the Daily Mail thinks we are.
Okay, more questions here, right behind you.
Hi, just on the idea of dealing with sexism by laughing at it instead of getting cross. Do you think that is something that's globally applicable to?
I don't know. It's no. In some sense, the answer to that has to be no. Right? If I have just been deprived of my reproductive rights in Texas, the idea that I should laugh it off, I don't think is an appropriate response. I think that I would say, though, that within a community like this, and I've had plenty of odd bits. I'm talking about here, I suppose, everyday sexism in Laura Bates's sense of, I'm not talking about some of the much bigger issues, which I think are not laughable. I think that we rely too much on outrage, and when we should keep our outrage for things that are really important. And we should find, there are other more effective weapons. I found this quite often in the classics faculty. Classics faculty in Cambridge, there is a degree of sort of embedded sexism, but they're not villains. They're not the enemy, right? They just need a bit of consciousness raising, and for some time here, not very long, for a couple of years, I was the only woman lecturer in the Faculty of Classics. And I suppose it was hard in some ways to think how to handle this. And I did start with a bit of outrage. In the end, I found teasing them made them realise, there they all were saying, but sir this and sir that, what would you, this is back in the 80s, what do you think, sir, and I thought, I can't say that, I would just sound like an actor, So I started saying, oh, come on, boys. And you suddenly saw, they thought, and they probably thought, oh, Mary Beard, should we ever have appointed her? This was, how trite, but it got to them. They suddenly saw that pomposity wasn't the be-all and end-all. And sometimes some people thought their pompousness was a bit silly. I used to say, don't go to the loo because I know that you always fix the vote in the loo and I can't come.
Well, we've got time for a couple more questions here. Can we go right to the back, the red top? And then we'll come, just wave again. So, yeah, you there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. Is that the right? Yeah. Sorry to ask you so many questions about Trump, but I'm an English student and I recently watched a 2018 production of Julius Caesar in which they kind of presented him as a Trump-like figure.
Yeah.
First of all, what did you think of that? And secondly, what do you think of this idea that kind of classical history is repeating itself in the modern day?
I don't, to answer the second first, I don't think it is directly character for character repeating itself. But I think that you can see structures of autocracy that mimic or appear to mimic or are similar. I mean, Roger mentioned the Julius Caesar biopic that we did. And in that, I have to confess another thing. It was not just a caesarean section at the beginning, but I spoof tweeted Trump because one of the things that we had wanted to draw out was not that Trump is modelling himself on Julius Caesar, but that one of the things the populist autocrat does is find a way of talking to the people outside the traditional mechanisms of state institutions. Right? Julius Caesar, I mean, I don't know how many of you have read Julius Caesar's commentaries on his brutal campaigns in Gaul, the Gallic Wars, genocide if ever there was one. But it is now thought, with some evidence, that these autobiographic accounts of what he was doing in Gaul were actually brought to Rome, read on street corners, bypassing the institution of the Senate and the assemblies, that what Trump was doing was very like that in a way, that he had seen that Twitter, as it then was a way of, and it's brilliant, I have to say, it's appalling, but it's brilliant. It was a way of speaking to the people without mediation. And there, I think, Caesar did that too. So I think that in terms of structures of reaching power, structures of autocracy, there are similar features, right? And so I'm happy to see a comparison between Trump and Caesar.
Okay,
but don't ask where it ends, because it doesn't end well in the end.
We need the microphone down here to City Scolaire Lyon. So can you get the?
Right.
Yeah, it might be better to pass it gently. Yeah. This is going to be a really good throw. This is great teamwork. I'm very impressed.
It's a lot better than just having a mic. So
this is the last question from the audience, okay? And I've got one more on.
Well, earlier you were talking about Socrates and the fact that it was a good way to have people debate about freedom of speech because it was part of the class. Well, that can be one of the advantages of classics. And I'll put a bit of self-definition here and say, as an MPhil student in classics, who also happens to be at Newnham, I'll put it like that. I was wondering if you truly thought this was the future of classics as a discipline, especially perhaps considering that I heard that one of the more conservative academics, David Butterfield, resigned very out of the blue, very surprisingly last year, saying that he didn't think the University of Cambridge provided an open space anymore for debate and discussion.
I think Butterfield was a clever guy, and I think that's just stupid. He said some stupid things, and that was a very stupid thing to say. Clever people say stupid things, and you try to forgive them for it. I do think that some of this is the future for classics, but I also think it always has been. I mean, go back to the gunpowder plot and the debates about terrorism, around the attempted blowing up of the Houses of Parliament. What is the big fictional case? Or what Roman case do they fictionalise? They fictionalise Cicero and the terrorist Catiline. And I think that why classics excites me is I have a real nerdy side. I really like to get to the bottom of things, and and it could be in anything. Honestly, I think nerds are nerds, and you can do it in many things. But why classics is so exciting is it has always provided that place where people debate. So it's not just about the ancient world. In that long history of how we try to see ourselves or not see ourselves or wonder about the kind of relevance that you were raising. Classics is about the ancient world and everything we've done to, about and around the ancient world over the last 2,000 years. And I think it always has been. I think it's not kind of that we just suddenly discovered classical reception. That classics has always been how we talked.
Okay, final online question from Carrie, one of our MST students, who says that she watches and reads Mary Beard anywhere she goes in the classic world. But her question, quick-fire final question, what would you consider the highlight of your career and your most important work?
Oh, shit. I don't know. I think the highlight of my career was getting an academic job. You know, it's those surprises. It's that they gave the job to me. I mean, my first job was at King's College London, and I still remember it, and I still remember going to sign on about a week after I'd got it to get the letter of appointment, whatever, and I went into the office where I was told to go, and they said, "Oh, good morning, Doctor," and then they named another candidate. And I thought, the classic, it was all a terrible error. I didn't get the job anyway. And it emerged that they had been expecting me. But I just thought, the idea that someone wants to give me a job to do what I really enjoy, that's, all the rest is icing on the cake.
Before I thank you, Mary, I'll do my usual plug for forthcoming events. So the Selwyn College Politics Society will be here, chaired in a session by Janet O'Sullivan on Thursday the 19th of June, looking at a year of Labour with an amazing panel of Tom Baldwin, Jill Rutter, Ryan Shorthouse and Lizzie Buchan. So that's Thursday the 19th of June. I also have promised a couple of times that West Streeting will be here, and I can confirm West Streeting will be here, and details of that will follow, so keep an eye on our social media and other accounts. But for tonight, I can testify that Mary is a really good friend to all of us here at Selwyn and has personally been incredibly supportive of me in the last few years. So I'm really grateful for that.
As
and I think
you have of me. Whenever I get into a scrape with the media, it's Roger I go to.
I think tonight we've seen an amazing array of knowledge and humanity and all sorts of good things. So please thank Mary Beard.
Could we just